was a podcast with Ezra Klein, with the person who was in charge of AI in the White House. And during the Biden administration, the meeting was, around April 2024. And so I think we should approach, these people and get more details. Now, the question is, should we push government to reveal what is, what is under wraps? What kind of physics has been hidden? Is it related to UAP? Is it related to new physics that the government knows about and wants to take advantage of in some ways? That would require a very efficient coordination, and also, even the Manhattan Project had spies in it, so somehow it leaked. And it's just hard for me to tell whether the government is competent enough to put a seal on a very important scientific discovery. I don't know what Eric thinks, but my fundamental belief is the government is not competent enough to do that. But maybe Eric thinks otherwise.
Well, I think that the story, again, you and I have both been tracking it when most of our PhD brethren will not, is roughly speaking that between 1952 and 1970-ish, 71, there was this golden age of general relativity that was largely funded by two people who looked like CIA cutouts, Roger Babson and Agnew Bainson. They worked particularly with Bryce DeWitt and Lewis Witten. There was an entire coordinated series of places that were working on gravity for engineering purposes. A lot of this got pushed out into aerospace companies, which is not a natural home for theoretical physics, but in particular, the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore was where Lewis Witten was posted. And I would say that Curtis Wright was where Feynman was probably going in his story, Any Questions, where he's giving physics lectures to aerospace people. So whatever this
surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman, where he's in a taxi cab and he tells the driver.
Yeah, tell me a place. He goes to the Alibi Room in Buffalo, New York. I think that's Curtis Wright Aerospace.
But Eric, do you think we should add that to the JFK, MLK, RFK files that should be released?
Avi, if you go back to my appearance on Joe Rogan's program, episode 1945, the year of the Trinity test, coincidentally, you'll see that I've basically been tracking this, and that story has now spread. Jesse Michaels has been spreading it. I would say David Kaiser knew about some of the story independently. Right. But more or less, yes, the golden age of general relativity is probably involved with some attempt at something like primitive space-time engineering. There's a 1971 Australian intelligence document by a physicist who talks about Dyson, Oppenheimer, DeWitt, Desser, a bunch of well-known people to all of us being involved with this. I don't think it was hyper successful, to be entirely honest. We know that the 1957 Chapel Hill conference had Feynman coming to it under the assumed name of Mr. Smith. So it's really weird behavior. Herman Bondi talked very clearly about removing the positivity constraints from general relativity to allow...
I spoke about this a couple of hours ago on this podcast. Yes.
Okay. All of these things had not been talked about much in recent years. And my feeling is I'm trying to get people to open the kimono as to were Babson and Bainson actually cutouts for CIA funding. And then you had these two charismatic, mysterious funders who couldn't be traced to the government. And did we move a lot of this stuff into aerospace? Because the one lesson of the Manhattan years, Avi, as you probably know, is that the best way to keep a secret is compartmentalization. Only the white badges knew what was going on at Los Alamos. Everyone else merely had a fragment.
Eric, we were talking before you came on about AI and effectively how it's sort of training us. And you've talked about what you coined in your traditional portmanteau or sobriquet or some neologism as your want.
And with the Lloyds, Keating.
Hey, keep it up. We'll have a minion soon over here. Okay, you called something fascinating. I first heard it from you in Florence last May, but you wrote about it as early as 2017. It's called outintelligence, and I think this is a fascinating concept that Avi might not be familiar with. But effectively, we discussed the fact that perhaps AI is training us. And I wonder, what Avi thinks about this idea that you've coined. Maybe you can describe it for those that aren't familiar. This concept of how intelligence perhaps evolves, and to what extent these GPUs plus LLMs, I call it open NVIDIA or whatever you want, how they might be locked in to a physics model that is doomed never to give us the new physics that you and I and Avi crave. So first of all, what's outintelligence, and how does it have bearing on perhaps solving these problems? Let's go beyond the conspiracy to cover things up and stuff that we've already talked about.
Sure. Artificial outintelligence is something I defined when something without a brain outsmarts something with a brain. So in particular, there's an entire clade of orchids called ophrys, which convince male pollinators that they are offering a female looking to mate via a replica from their lowest petal, along with the pheromones to prove that she's ready and waiting. So when these male pollinators are duped twice, the plant is able to pollinate without having to pay in terms of energetic nectar or pollen, which is expensive. So how did the plant outsmart the thing with an actual brain? Well, it used its brain against itself. It said, look, if I can fool you twice, even though I'm not thinking, I get a benefit. So the key thing is you will sculpt the replica of the female of your species based on your own poor eyesight or failure to understand what situation you're in. As a result, what you have is you have something without the ability to think, hijacking the mind of the thing that can think to parasitize itself. So if you wanted to take that into the realm of artificial machine learning, imagine that this thing is basically just linear algebra, but there we are interacting with it, and we either reward it by telling it it's doing great, or we punish it by moving to another model. And there are only three elements necessary for evolution, and they have nothing to do with carbon-based life. You have to have heritability, you have to have variation so that you're not all doing the same strategy, and then you have to have differential success. Now, all three of those things take place within programs. Programs are the only place with a reproductive system, the only thing man knows how to build from scratch that has the ability to reproduce. You can build a car, it'll have all the physiological systems of a human being, except for one, it doesn't manufacture more cars. So software is the only place where we can build an analog of the reproductive system, and therefore it's the only place that has room for artificial life. Artificial outintelligence is non-thinking life that uses the deficits in cognition of thinking life to outsmart thinking life.
So, Avi, let me ask you that question. We were talking about Oumuamua. So I have a fragment here, Eric, of Oumuamua. I don't know if you can see it. So yep, Avi gave it to me. He gave it to me along with a sample.
Avi, how come Brian gets a Oumuamua?
So, Avi, let's examine this. I've been thinking when I heard Eric talk about this for the first time, I actually thought of you. The conjecture that I'm going to make, I want you to play upon it. Could Oumuamua be exactly what Eric's just described? Could it be not, an alien artifact, a light sail, a probe based on its weird acceleration and shape? But what if it's a smart, not a smart device, but basically an outintelligent device, an object from another civilization, like Eric just described, something that's a simple system, evolving, replicating, spreading across space and time, not to communicate or anything, but could it be fitting the mold that Eric just described? That would explain perhaps, why we see it less as a messenger and more as a trickster, or something that, could potentially evade the Fermi paradox. So it's not really what we think it is. It's more like what Eric just described. How do you react to that as Oumuamua's, true nature, as I'm just conjecturing? This is Eric's idea, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. And we know the story about the Trojan horse that was thought to be something else. And, we know that nature is based on natural selection. So that means that the fittest survives. And one way to be the fittest is to pretend to be something else so that nobody suspects at what you are actually trying to accomplish, which may very well describe the interaction of AI systems with us in the future. But we would think that they're serving us, but not really. So I think the best way for us to figure it out is to get as much data as possible. The more data we have, the better the less we are impressed by superficial markings. And what I really am happy with a flood of data. And in my mind, we have now the Webb telescope, we have other new telescopes on Earth that if the Rubin Observatory discovers a Oumuamua-like object, we can just put all the resources on it, try to figure out what it means. I think, our imagination is limited by what we experienced in the past. And that is true in our, when you go on a date, the interaction that you have depends on your past dates. And if we are confronting something completely new, we are just responding inappropriately because we've never seen something like it. The academia would be the first to always make analogies and call it a dark comet and say that it's a rock of a type that we've never seen before, but it's still a rock and we should not discuss anything else. That is human nature, to assume that, to interpret everything in terms of the narratives of the story that you already have. But the people who are curious are the ones that will learn something. And so I think science offers us this opportunity of learning something new. And all we need to do is be open-minded and collect data and put money into the effort. We can't just assume the data will fall into our lap. We have to invest time and money. And so instead of putting money into things that we already fully understand, like putting, $1 billion towards a future telescope that will measure the power spectrum of density fluctuations of dark matter to the next decimal point. I mean,
okay. I have to cut you off there. You're encroaching on how the bread is buttered in the Keating household. I will not allow you to cut off funding for the Simons Observer.
No, but I mean, the amount of new information that you get is relatively marginal. And obviously, it's a safe territory because you know what you will find. The one thing I realized when getting funded by NASA was that they were asking, what will I discover in year one when I applied to grants? That's an oxymoron to say, I'll give you the money as long as you tell me what you will discover in the first year.
Now, you forgot what Isidore Rabbi said. He said, never apply for something that you haven't already accomplished.
Yes, exactly. That's the approach I took. I basically asked them for money for something I already written about. And the referees just were not aware of that. And so, yeah, I think science, there is something to be said about Mark Andreessen's insights into the way that science operates and the way that it should be revised. The question is, should we reboot everything, the entire system, or maybe promote or reward scientists who behave differently?
Now, Eric, you've talked a lot about, escaping Einstein's prison, not Weinstein's prison, but what do you mean by that? I mean, do you believe that it's a lack of funding? My theoretical physicist colleagues that you've debated and met here at UC San Diego and elsewhere, they get by on a couple of glasses of Lavazza or what have you. Avi doesn't need that much. He seems to have a lot of people that show up to his house and give him money. I'd kind of like that, to be honest with you. But besides that, Eric, what is missing? Is it funding? I mean, did Einstein, only make a breakthrough when he got the money from his Nobel Prize in 1922? Or what is the prison, and what is the most effective jailbreaking tool?
We're all over the place here. Einstein's prison is the distance to the nearest habitable worlds. So that if we imagine that we were going to somehow travel just below the speed of light in an Einsteinian way, full benefits of time dilation, you found the closest habitable planet, you stayed there for an hour and you came back. How much older is everyone here on Earth, even if you were able to make the trip lickety split? It's a depressingly large distance to the outside world. So that moat, effectively, if there's an Einsteinian speed limit, we have to recognize that it belongs to the map, which is known as space-time, which is not the territory, which which is wherever we actually live, where we do not live in space-time. But that is our best map that we have. So that's what I mean by Einstein's prison. But now you have a second question, which is like, what are we doing wrong, and why can't we just exist on the dew found on a single leaf at sunrise of a daffodil? And the answer is, first of all, it's an obnoxious question. You have opportunity costs that are set by investment banking, management consulting, and big law. And we have to be paid a decent percentage of those things to get the best and the brightest. And that's our own best and our own brightest, because we are the big dogs. I also believe that we have to have an understanding of what makes science unexciting. And if I'm going to be blunt about the area that I care about, the people who are in a position to jailbreak us by pointing out that space-time was a stepping stone in a succession of models to a final theory where we actually have the source code, you cannot let those people use their positions as referees to kill off everyone else who doesn't subscribe to the only game in town theory. The perennial argument is, what's wrong with string theory? Is always around, well, it doesn't agree with it doesn't give new predictions, it's background independence. It has nothing to do with it. It's got a murderous sociology. That's 100% the reason that we actually care, and everybody's afraid to say it. Brian, if I can take issue even with you, you took issue with me saying that Lenny Susskind has been absolutely cruel to people who come up with alternates. And you didn't go after Lenny. You pointed out that I used some indelicate French. But the fact is, on the program that he shared with Kurt Jaimungal, he said that our colleague Peter Woit's math and physics is just bad. I don't think Lenny Susskind knows enough mathematics to critique Peter Woit. Peter Woit is by far the more experienced mathematically. I'd recommend his book on symmetry and quantum theory to anyone. You can't have Lenny Susskind going around like an ignoramus, pretending that he doesn't know who I am when I've talked to him at Stanford extensively. You can't have him going after Peter Woit, saying that Peter Woit is just bad, because he's not. Nobody wants to go after the big 10 people, let's say, in our field.
Well, I think you find who the Big Ten are. You've accused Kaku of being one of the Big Ten. He's simply not. I mean,
No,
and Lenny simply isn't either.
There's two lists here, Brian. One list is the 5 or 6 people through whom all physics seems to flow to the public. And in that group, that's basically Brian Greene, Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Michio Kaku, Lawrence Krauss. It's a very small number of people. That's one group. Then there's another different group, which is, who are the purported leaders of fundamental physics in theory? And that group has been by far the more merciless. Both groups attack anyone coming from outside, but it is the latter group in which Susskind is prominent, because both, and by the way, I will point out, Michio Kaku did a fair amount of really good writing on string field theory when that was, one of the candidates.
1971, yeah.
Well, later than that. He wrote a textbook that I can, on another program, I can get you the copyright date. Again, this isn't personal. These are just people who went bad, and they decided that they would have a career extolling the virtues of a theory that can't ship, and crapping on everybody else who comes up with the challenger theory. And the reluctance of anyone to want to say something against Lenny Susskind or Ed Witten or Jeff Harvey or any one of that crew, Andy Strominger, Kumran Vafa, Michael Duff, that is a real problem, is that we just don't have courage. And lacking courage, we're not going to get funded, because quite honestly, what we do too often is not interesting. You want to get interesting, you have to go back to actually working on the physical world in which we live.
Avi, how do you react to that? I mean, there's a difference between the popularizers, who you and I agree, is an important role to fill, and that we get paid by the public. We have to give back to the public. They're our bosses. At the same time, those that spend their time popularizing often don't spend their time, in the laboratory or at the blackboard. So how do you balance that? Your colleague, Kamran Vafa, was on my show, And I, criticized him at the standard critique that there's no, tangible, falsifiable, evidence against or for string theory that could plausibly come about. He said, "No, Brian, you're wrong." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, the string theory predicts the mass of the electron should be somewhere between, 0.000, 10 to the minus 32 Planck masses and 10 to the 100th Planck mass. Now, that counts, right? I mean, that's a prediction. It could be falsified, right? But it's not very satisfying to me. It was like, eating a meal of cotton candy and Sprite. But tell me, Avi, how do you react to what Eric's saying, that there's cabal? I mean, by the way, Eric, I have to say, you're talking to, not a cabal. Okay, fine. But you're talking to a Harvard professor who's paid very well. I'm a public, employee of the state of California. I'm paid less, but I'm paid well. You said earlier, we need to fund them like hedge fund managers. Fine, but you're talking to
I didn't say that. I said we need to fund them as a percentage of the opportunity cost.
But then, would you fund Ed Witten and Lenny Susskind?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's yes. Very high integrity, as is your one.
You wouldn't do the same in return. They're murderous.
No, I know.
I'm not murderous.
How do you react to that? You've got them in. You could presumably cause the career of a young person who's applying to the physics department or the astronomy department, who's got their head in the clouds and is riding a bandwagon and part of the groupthink that Eric's rightfully decrying. You could stifle them, but you don't.